If you've found your way here because the world's a little too loud, you've found the right place. There's no rush here, just a quiet corner to rest your eyes and your mind. Let's sit a spell and read a story together. Do you know that old fairy tale, The Elves and the Shoemaker? In this story, the cobbler is down to his last scrap of leather. He needs a miracle. I've taken this old fairy tale and rewritten it as if it happened here in the Appalachian foothills. These are my grandpa Ercel's. He was a young father during the Great Depression. He didn't have elves, but he did have a set of cast iron shoe lasts. These are the smallest sizes from a whole set. He used them to keep his family's shoes repaired. What a relief it must be to know you have the right tool, that you have the skill, or even if you don't, you have friends, family, neighbors who do.
They say that the forest holds its breath just before the first snow, and it was on such a night that an old cobbler sat late at his bench. The wind whipped down the ridge with a thin, lonely sound and whistled through the cedar shakes of his shack. His wife was already to bed, bundled under a mountain of heavy quilts, and the fire had burned down to a low orange huddle in the hearth. This man was usually a hard-working and happy fellow, but the world had grown heavy. Times had turned hard on the ridge. There was no money for new leather. Folk were patching the soles of their shoes with cardboard rather than coming to him for fixing, much less buying new shoes. And now he had nothing left but his heavy cast-iron cobbler's kit and his last, best scrap of tanned hide. He had saved it, hoping for better times, and now it stared at him, thin, supple, and as rich as the plowed fields in spring. Taking this last piece of precious leather, the cobbler sorted through his well-worn patterns, choosing the one that would fit just right. He traced with a steady hand, carefully cut each piece, and then laid them out, ready for stitching in the morning. Still sitting at his workbench, the cobbler quietly said his prayers. He didn't ask for a miracle. He just asked for the strength to finish his work well come sunrise. Whatever would be, would be. Then the old man blew out the candle and followed the darkness to bed. When the gray light of morning finally crept over the windowsill and the fire was set to crackling to chase away the chill, the cobbler sat down to his bench and reached for his well-worn awl. But he dropped his arm in shock and sat still staring. There, right where he'd left the cut shoe leather, was a pair of boots so stout and so fine that they seemed otherworldly. "Look at these boots, wife," he called out, his voice thick with wonder. The cobbler's wife turned from her kettle, wrapped her shawl tight against the chill, and rushed over to her husband's workbench. Peering over her husband's shoulder, she looked with amazement at the finished boots in her husband's hands. He pointed to a perfectly stitched seam. "There's not a man on these mountains who could pull a stitch that tight." Together they wondered who could have come in the dead of night without their knowing and leave behind such a near-perfect set of shoes. That same morning, before the sun cleared the pines, a traveler came up the hill and knocked on the door of the cobbler's cottage. The stranger had wandered high and low, crossing ridges and fording creeks in a desperate search for a good pair of boots for his journey. He'd found nothing but shoddy work and stiff leather. But when he laid eyes on the boots resting on the cobbler's workbench, his eyes lit up. The traveler quickly slipped on those boots and paced the floor. Why, they fit his feet like a second skin and felt as sturdy as the mountain itself. The stranger was so overcome with pleasure that he pulled out twice the asking price from his purse. "I won't take a penny less for them," he insisted, "because that's the least they're worth. I've a long road ahead of me, and I'd sooner walk it with a light heart than a heavy debt." As the traveler stepped back out into the morning mist, he turned and promised to spread the word far and wide, telling folks of the excellent workmanship of the hillside cobbler. With the coins heavy in his pocket, the cobbler didn't waste a moment. The old man near slid down the hill to the tanner's, his heart light as a bird. He knew exactly what he wanted. For months he'd been eyeing a piece of calfskin leather, so soft and supple it felt like silk, but with a grain as tough as oak. He fingered it every time he stopped by, knowing it would make the finest boots in the county, but he had never been able to claim it. That day he laid his money down with a grin and carried the calf hide home like a treasure. Before the sun had set, the shoemaker had traced out and cut 2 more pairs of boots, the best he'd ever created, laying them carefully over his iron lasts. He went to bed with a new hope, hardly able to wait for the next morning's work. Dawn came and the cobbler went whistling to his bench. But shortly the tune faded from his lips. He stood there rooted to the floor. Surely his eyes were playing tricks. There sat 2 pairs of completed boots, the edges burnished smooth, and the honey gold leather gleaming with a luster that only comes from the finest handiwork. Just like the day before, those boots didn't sit long on the cobbler's workbench. Folks bought them up by noon, and the silver that the cobbler earned was enough to buy a whole roll of the finest leather, enough for 4 pairs of boots. It went on just that way time and time again. 8 pairs of the best boots, then 16. What the old man cut out in the evening was finished by the time the rooster crowed the next morning. Word traveled through the gaps and past the ridges, and soon the hillside cobbler had a steady stream of folks at his door. The ridge, once so quiet and heavy with worry, was now alive with the sounds of visitors and the clink of their coins filling the stone jar. The lean years were behind them. The flour barrel stayed full. There was meat hung in the smokehouse, and the cobbler's hands were never idle. Now it happened that one evening, not long before Christmas, after the old man had just finished cutting out his leather for the day, he turned to his helpmeet by the hearth. "Wife," he said, "we've been blessed beyond our deserving. What think you if we stay up tonight? I'd like to see the face of the neighbor who's been leaning into this work for us." She liked the idea, for she was a woman who believed in meeting a kindness face to face. So the cobbler and his wife didn't blow out the lantern this time. Instead, they turned down the wick and tucked the low light behind a stone crock. Then they hid themselves behind a row of heavy coats and waited in the dark. Their only company was the slow tick of the clock and the crackling of the fire until the clock struck the deepest hour of the night. At midnight, the air in the room changed, turning as sharp and crisp as a mountain frost. 2 tiny figures no taller than new-sprung corn came hopping through a gap in the window frame. They were wee folk of the forest, but they weren't wearing the velvet or the lace of the old world stories. They were bare as the day they were born, their skin pale and shimmering like moonlight on the forest pond. Their hair wild as briars on the side of their heads, and their eyes held the spark of the North Star. The wee men didn't waste a second. With a nimble leap, they were up on the workbench, moving among the tools like they'd been born to them. Their little fingers moved like hummingbirds, pulling thread through the leather with a speed that made the cobbler's eyes ache to watch. They worked with a frantic, feverish delight, their tiny hammers making a sound like hail on a tin roof. The moment the last knot was tied, they didn't say a word. They simply faded back into the night as quietly as they came. The next morning, the shoemaker's wife studied the neat line of newly stitched boots sitting on her husband's workbench. And then she gazed back at the frosty window. "Husband," she said softly, "those little men saved us from starvation, yet they haven't a stitch of clothing to cover them against the cold. It's a poor heart that isn't grateful. I'm going to sew them some proper clothes, woolen coats and breeches, warm flannel shirts, and knit them each a pair of fine stockings. And I," said the cobbler, "will make them the best sturdy boots ever seen." So on Christmas Eve, instead of leather, they laid out their gifts: perfectly stitched little pants, 2 shirts, 2 warm coats, stockings, and the finest pairs of little boots ever seen. The cobbler and his wife watched from the shadows as the wee folk returned. When the little men saw the warm clothes and the tiny sturdy boots, they didn't just put them on, they celebrated. The little men hooted and danced across the floorboards, their new boots clicking against the wood with a rhythm so true that they burst out in song. Woolen coats and boots so new, we finished all we came to do. Fine as kings and twice as free, no more cobblers will we be. They danced right out into the snowy night and were never seen in that ridge again. But they left something behind that didn't go away with them. The cobbler never wanted for work again, and his hands never lost their steady strength. He lived out his days with a full heart, always remembering that even in the leanest years, if you lay the leather out, the help will find you.